In the 1950s, the US and Soviet Union realized something terrifying. The first country to dominate space would gain the ultimate strategic and military advantage. Today, a new race is unfolding. It's not about the moon, it's about money. And the first to secure Bitcoin strategic reserve could win the game. We go backstage with Mark Moss at Bitcoin MENA 2024 and ask, is Bitcoin the new arms race for hard money, or is it already too late to catch up? Let's mine deep. For years, governments scoffed at Bitcoin. They called it a joke, a Ponzi scheme, a tool for criminals. But here's the reality check. You can't ban Bitcoin. You can't shut it down. The only thing you can stop is yourself from having it. And now countries are waking up to the game theory driving the Bitcoin network. Just like in the Cold War, nations are now making strategic moves behind the scenes to best their adversaries. Bhutan and Russia have been quietly mining Bitcoin for years. Abu Dhabi and Norway's sovereign wealth funds have begun allocating. China and India are de-dollarizing at record speed. And now, US pension funds and state treasuries are stacking Bitcoin. And with Donald Trump's campaign promise to make the US a Bitcoin superpower, it seems the Bitcoin space race is officially on. People like Michael Saylor saw the writing on the walls years ago, using Bitcoin as a strategic asset to save his company from drifting into irrelevance. So how does he see it play out for governments?
So if you're the United States, what are you worried about? Losing your world reserve currency status. Where's the money going to go? To Bitcoin. How do you hedge that? Just go to where everybody's going and buy 20% of it, and then when they get there, you'll be fine. Now, where else are you going to go?
Saylor lays it out clearly. Bitcoin isn't just an investment, it's a strategy. And the game theory is ruthless. Until recently, only small nations have been stacking sats. Bhutan is mining, El Salvador made it legal tender, but the real game changer? A major world power making Bitcoin a strategic reserve asset. If the US moves first, it sets the blueprint for nation-state Bitcoin adoption and integrates it into the existing economic order. But if an adversary moves first, say China, Russia, or a coalition of BRICS nations, the US loses a key card in this monetary arms race. So why should you care? Because history doesn't remember who had the most satellites or trips to space. It remembers who set foot on the moon first. I know some small fraction of you might not believe the last part ever happened, but bear with me for the sake of this analogy. Think about the British pound in the early 1900s. It was the dominant global currency, backed by the largest gold reserves. Britain controlled trade and dictated the financial system until World War I drained its reserves. Meanwhile, the US accumulated gold. And by the end of World War II, it had enough assets and leverage to dictate Bretton Woods. The British pound lost its status as reserve currency, and the US dollar took its place. Now imagine the same story, but this time the US is Britain. If another major power moves first, China, Russia, or BRICS nations leveraging Bitcoin as a neutral reserve asset, the US risks losing the financial edge that made it a superpower. It wouldn't matter if the US eventually caught up. The standard would already be set. This isn't just about buying an asset. It's about securing monetary power for the next century. If the US leads, it sets the terms. If it lags, it becomes a financial follower in a Bitcoin-denominated world. And if you think Bitcoin is too small to matter, well, that's exactly what the UK thought about the dollar 100 years ago. We go backstage with Mark Moss at Bitcoin MENA 2024 to talk about the race for hard money. The Bitcoin Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
How is that looking like?
Yeah, the strategic reserve is a really big thing, and I think it's bigger than even most people even fail to comprehend, because what you have is, one, the United States introducing this bill, which I think has a high likelihood of going through the poly market, betting markets. It's like a 25% chance. I think that's low. I think it's probably 50 to 60%. Trump said he would do it. RFK said he would do it. They are obviously working together. Senator Lummis already submitted the bill, so that's already going through. And we have sort of this red House, Senate, and presidency to get it through. And if it fails, it'll be resubmitted and go through. So I'm pretty bullish on that. But here's why I think the implications are misunderstood or maybe misstated is that, when El Salvador announced their Bitcoin system, El Salvador is not really an influencer nation. They're one of the poorest nations in the world. But now that they've had such amazing results, now they're at the point where the Bitcoin's gone up enough to pay off their IMF loans. So now other nations are starting to pay attention, and Bukele has met with over 40 leaders of other nations, right? But if the U.S. does it, the U.S. is the leader of the world, right? It has the U.S. dollar, the reserve currency of the world. If the U.S. does it, then the rest of the world is going to have to act. And now we're talking about the G7, we're talking about the G20. That could kick off a stampede, if you will, a frenzy that just is, it's hard to comprehend because Bitcoin, when you look at commodities, you measure them based off supply and demand. And that could be difficult with oil because I don't know what the supply of oil is. But with Bitcoin, we know the supply is fixed. So then you just have to look at the demand. And when you look at sovereigns FOMOing in, it's going to be massive.
And it's funny you mentioned the IMF because what's going to happen to the U.S. if they decide to adopt Bitcoin? Because when El Salvador tried to, adopt Bitcoin in the beginning, IMF was like, yo, don't do that. That's not good.
Yeah, I don't think the U.S. is worried about the IMF, right? I think it's a small, yeah, exactly, right? So I don't think that's a big deal. And, I don't think that Bitcoin gets rid of the need to take loans. I don't envision this world where there's no more credit. As a matter of fact, credit was around before money. Even barter credit was there before money. So there will always be loans. But what's interesting is what El Salvador did is took some of their money and put it into Bitcoin, allowed it to grow for a period of time until it was able to pay off the loan. And that's sort of what the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is doing with the United States. Whereas if we took a little bit, a couple million, 10 million, 100 million, put it into Bitcoin, maybe in 5 to 10 years, it's enough to pay off the $36 trillion of debt that we have.
Do you think the end of the Federal Reserve is coming soon if we do adopt, a Bitcoin strategic reserve?
Depends on what you consider soon, but overall I would say no. And not for decades at least, for sure. And the reason why is because Bitcoin is competing for a lot of things, but ultimately right now it's in the store of value phase. So most people realize they shouldn't store their wealth in currency. So we buy houses, we buy stocks, we buy bonds, we buy collectibles, fine art, we buy all types of things to store our wealth. Bitcoin is competing against those things. Nobody thinks they should store their wealth in money. So Bitcoin isn't competing against Bitcoin or money, dollars as a store of value. So it's going to take value from the bonds, the real estate, the currencies, things like that. And eventually, maybe after 2050, it starts to threaten the currencies, maybe 2040. But I don't think the Federal Reserve is out of business, not for a while. I think the Fed's around for a long time. I think they'll be printing money for a long time. A lot of people think the death of the dollar is imminent, but it's a process, not an event. And we have to think back through history, right? So when the dollar took over the reserve standard of the world from the pound sterling, for example, that was about a 40-year process. A 40-year process. And even today, over 100 years later, the pound sterling is still the third most used currency in the world. And UK doesn't even have any exports that they send out, right? So these things happen over decades. And so we're, 15 years in. It's not going to happen for a while. And even if it does take over, like the dollar took over from the pound sterling, it doesn't mean it goes away necessarily. So I think, yes, it happens, but over a really long period of time.